Today, I want to talk about juvenile delinquency through the lens of intersectionality. We can't look at delinquency and prevention as male versus female, black versus white, sex offense versus general offense. Research over the last quarter century has found that there is not really a one-size-fits-all approach to curbing delinquency, and that treatment should really focus on addressing multiple institutions at once, such as communities, families, schools, and also peers. Yet, teens have unique and complicated lives, and what might work for a wealthy male youth in communities with access to resources may not be the same for queer Hispanic females in other settings. Thus, if we want to figure out what works in the best interest of the child, intersectionality matters. And intersectionality must go beyond race-gender dyads. We also need to consider intersectionalities of disabilities, co-occurring disorders like substance abuse, and being a member of the LGBTQ community. Let's start with girls. Much of what we know about delinquency has stemmed from studies that have primarily focused on samples of males, and for good reason, as rates of delinquency are much higher for male than female youth. Yet, females accounted for 30% of all juvenile arrests in 2019, which is a sizable proportion of youth that are worthy of further exploration. So much so that studies have found overlapping yet unique differences between male and female justice-involved youth. Scholars have argued that pathways to offending are gendered, and that how youth end up engaging in delinquency looks different for males versus females. For both boys and girls, youth are significantly more likely to engage in delinquency when they are raised by parents who are authoritative and cold, have a history of criminal behavior, have inadequate supervision from adults, and associating with delinquent peers, also doing poorly in school and growing up in poverty. Yet, there are also risk factors that make delinquency unique for females. These include things like having a revolving door of caregivers, having a history of running away, early puberty, and having older male friends and partners. And what's important to understand is that when confronted with female youth involved in delinquency, it's important for us to assess for a history of trauma and victimization. Several studies have found that female delinquency is really shaped by prior maltreatment during childhood, and studies have found that compared to boys, justice-involved females report higher rates of physical and sexual violence during childhood. Taking what we know from brain development and the ACE studies, the stress and trauma from maltreatment can create heightened stress response systems that cause them to act out during adolescence and even in adulthood. And even more, female youth involved in delinquency tend to have older male friends and partners compared to male youth. And so part of this may be due to women maturing faster than men, but the criminologist in me cannot ignore the fact that a prior history of abuse from older adult males may contribute to older males taking advantage of younger females during their teen years. Child sexual abuse often involves grooming tactics where abusers will exploit vulnerabilities to get children to comply. And female youth who struggle with anxiety, depression, supervision, and issues with self-esteem, all of which may come from a history of maltreatment, may make them more susceptible to older men who exploit these vulnerabilities. And running around with older male friends and partner places a lot of pressures on young women to fit in and comply with peer pressure, which may lead to early pregnancy, substance abuse issues, and early involvement in the juvenile justice system. In justice-involved, females are also more likely to have a higher degree of co-occurring problems related to mental health, substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, and physical health problems. So that being said, these findings show that we have to understand what is in the best interest of a child while considering intersectionalities that play a role in shaping responses to these behaviors. So according to a 2015 report by the National Council on Disabilities, although accounting for 13% of all public school students, those with learning, and behavioral disabilities were arrested nearly 3 times more often than students without such challenges. And youth with disabilities made up 71% of students who were physically restrained in schools and up to 85% of youth in juvenile detention centers in 2016. Even more, youth with disabilities are twice as likely to receive exclusionary practices at school than youth who do not have disabilities. And as a result, a lot of times kids end up in the juvenile justice system based on mental health issues that are underaddressed or overlooked, especially for many kids from low-income communities where their first encounter with mental health services comes by way of the juvenile justice system. And prison is not where we should be sending people for mental health care, because you cannot fix trauma with trauma. And students with disabilities are oftentimes unable to signal to teachers, police officers, and other authority figures in a way that's acceptable to social norms. When they're unable to communicate or respond in those ways, then they are criminalized. And exclusionary practices disadvantage students with disabilities so much more. For example, students with disabilities are largely entitled to individualized education plans, or IEPs, which these essentially deliver a more personalized learning experience and can include services as occupational therapy, physical therapy, and even mental health support. Yet when students with disabilities are arrested at school or suspended or even expelled, these students lose a lot more than kids who don't have disabilities and don't need the additional services while in school. And navigating the juvenile justice system does nothing to help. The most common disabilities among justice-involved youth are intellectual and emotional issues. Yet, as of 2015, there's only 24 states who have formal requirements for mental health screening in detention centers, and that's according to the Juvenile Justice Geography, Policy, Practice, and Statistics. Considering findings from a recent study of nearly 60,000 juvenile justice cases in a single mid-Atlantic state, this is problematic. So in this study, they use cases processed during 2015 and 2016. Scholars from Old Dominion University found that youth with disabilities, mental health problems, and past histories of victimization were significantly more likely to be treated more harshly at intake, and findings indicated a 40 to 60% decrease in the odds of these youth receiving diversion versus being detained in a detention center until further hearings. Additionally, youth with disabilities were significantly more likely to be adjudicated than youth without disabilities, and this was particularly salient for boys that had disabilities. And even when youth with special needs receive out-of-home placements such as residential treatment or youth detention centers, services are not always catered towards the unique needs of these youth. In a 2014 study by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, they found that half of youth with identifiable disorders did not receive appropriate services, with as many as 59% of the incarcerated kids not receiving treatment for mood and anxiety disorders. And it seems like the only issue-specific programs for youth in custody are reserved for youth who are adjudicated of sexual offenses. And even then, we have an ongoing debate about whether there needs to be specific treatment centers for youth who are struggling with sexual issues. For example, in a 2018 study by researchers from the Peabody Research Institute, meta-analytic findings showed that the effects of sex offense-specific treatment for all youth offenders or for all juvenile sex offenders is questionable than general treatment for all youth offenders. And the authors, they argued that we tend to treat youth sex offenses as a different type of juvenile offense, when in reality, the majority of juveniles who commit sex offenses are what we call generalist offenders who just so happen to commit a sexual offense. And what was the most shocking from the readings this week was really the lack of quality evidence to inform what does and does not work for preventing delinquency and recidivism among justice-involved youth. In fact, it is estimated that only 5 to 9% of eligible high-risk juvenile offenders in the United States are even provided with evidence-based treatments. Yet, research is booming, and more is coming out to enhance prevention and resiliency among youth. So a couple recommendations to really help relate to, because of issues with access to adequate education in the juvenile justice system, there needs to be early intervention programs in not only schools, but child welfare systems that can help prevent entry into the juvenile justice system. So systems should really be developed to provide stability and caregiving, especially for females, as well as dealing with issues of substance abuse, attendance, youth who spend time with other delinquent youth, and especially mental health services for youth, not only in schools, but in the community. And services need to continue even after involvement in the system. And while some communities believe detaining youth is the only way for them to receive mental health services, services and resources are not always available when they are released. And youth who are processed through the system tend to have worse outcomes than those who are not. So reforms really need to consider aftercare programs for youth that can ensure they have continuous access to mental health and counseling services. And finally, we cannot assess problems in isolation and not look at them through a lens of intersectionality. It's not just that young black males have worse outcomes than all other race-gender dyads. It's worse for black male youths who have disabilities, who are LGBTQ and or have mental health problems. And there's not always laws or policies mandating mental health screenings for youth in custody. So many of these issues remain undiagnosed or overlooked, or in a lot of these cases confused for misbehavior. And treatment cannot focus on youth specifically. It must be encompassing of their friends, their families, schools, and their neighborhoods. All have to take a part in helping prevent and reduce delinquency. And it takes a village to prevent and reduce delinquency, but more so if the village has support and resources to do so.